Hey guys, this is Steve Richert from livingvertical.org, and this is my Friday night live stream. And tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about the Panasonic Lumix GH5 and the autofocus, and some of my experience shooting with it of recently. I'm actually down in Virginia right now at my brother's, which is part of the reason why you may notice that I have a slightly different setup going on back here. And I'm actually down here doing a little bit of logging as opposed to vlogging. Actually doing a little logging and vlogging. So tonight what I want to do is just tell you a little bit about kind of what I've been doing with the GH5, some of my experience using it. I've put out a few videos about the GH5. Also talk to you a little bit about timber harvesting and logging, which is what I'm doing to support my photography habit right now. Every week I try to do this live stream around 11 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, and as I go through these live streams, usually what I do is I'll pick a topic or something that is sort of relevant to what I've been shooting or what I've been working on creatively over the past week, and then I will address that topic. And if you're watching this after the fact, I'm interacting with people in the audience here and there and taking questions. So when you guys have questions, I'm always keen to divert from whatever topic I have to discuss to be able to let you guys steer the conversation. And I'm always happy to have folks here joining me. So I'm going to do the best that I can tonight to answer questions when they come up, whatever sort of questions that you have. Now, for those of you who may not have seen the videos that I do, I do talk a lot about the gear that I use because I enjoy that. I'm a fan of cameras. I like photography and I like making videos, but I also just like cameras, and that's a downfall for me on some levels. But I also, beyond just talking about gear and reviewing gear, I really enjoy being able to talk about what I have a camera for, what I want to do with my camera, which is to be able to tell my story and to be able to do more because I have a camera. And that's really the philosophy that guides everything that I do, and it's important, I think, for any discussion of a camera to also incorporate an understanding of why cameras are important to us as individuals. And so without further ado, my co-star for this evening, which is the GH5. And this is a camera that I have been using a lot for the last 2 weeks or so. And one of the things that I got this camera for and that I really wanted to do was to be able to test this as a stills camera. So being able to kind of compare this against the Fuji X-T2, for example. And what I would encourage is, if you follow me on Twitter, on Instagram, I haven't gotten around to sharing a lot of the pictures that I've taken with the GH5 there, but on Twitter it's a little bit less curated and a little bit more personal of kind of the things that I'm shooting on a day-to-day basis. And so I put some of those photos there on my Twitter stream, which is @livingvertical, and that's the name of my website and this channel. And frankly, I'm been kind of all over the shop here with this camera, and I want to say to start out with that I don't believe in the concept of a good camera or a bad camera, at least not in this day and age when you spend around $1,000 or more. It's really hard to get a camera that is bad as such. I think it's definitely very easy for people to get cameras that are not appropriate for the type of work that they want to do, or a camera that has limitations that doesn't align with your personal needs or style. And so what I'm always trying to do when I'm discussing the camera is to really, number one, just help myself understand and articulate what I need out of the camera, and do it in a way that is, thinking out loud helps me a great deal. And so I think that that can potentially be of use to other people. And sometimes people ask me for recommendations on cameras. You know, and if I speak favorably about a camera like the GH5, and you know, I've gotten some flack from people for saying that it's a good camera, and I really am impressed with it, because some people are like, the autofocus sucks, it's terrible. And that's one of the things I want to address tonight in this live stream, is to talk a little bit about the autofocus and what I've experienced with that so far. You know, but different people have different needs, and it's always very tempting to evaluate a camera as being good or bad based on one particular facet of what that camera does, and whether or not that matches up with what you're doing or with what I'm doing. And so there are people that brand bigots, for lack of a better term, that are like, everybody who shoots Sony sucks, they're all a bunch of idiots, or everybody who shoots Panasonic is, you know, they're just like, you know, they have no idea of like class and how to design a beautiful camera like my Leica or like the Fuji, which, you know, and I shoot a whole bunch of different types of cameras. And so this is something that I struggle with, because at the end of the day, as much as my personal bias, like if cameras were people, you know, my Fuji is that really impractical date that I could never marry, but I would love to have a fling with, and it does so many things so well, but there's a handful of things that the Fuji doesn't do for me, since I shoot video. And of course, the GH5 was that much more exciting, because everybody talked about it being a very promising stills camera. And so when I got it 2 weeks ago, one of the first videos that I did about the GH5 specifically, aside from unboxing it here on the air during my first, that one live stream, was to go out and just shoot some still images, because I already know that the video is going to be very impressive. Again, not perfect, and there are certain things that the GH5 does not do flawlessly. It has limitations, certainly, but the stills was really the big question that I had. And by all means, guys, if you have questions about any of this stuff, you know, jump in, throw them out there. This isn't a prepared monologue. This is just kind of off the top of my head, and I'm always happy to field questions that you guys might have too. So in the style of shooting that I do, adventure and documentary style photography and video work, I'm outside, I don't have access to a lot of power, and I can't carry around a lot of stuff. So I have unrealistic expectations of all of my gear, and it's terrible, because that means I'm always being disappointed, usually in one form or another. In another way, it's also given me a certain level of comfort with the knowledge that I'm going to have to adapt to situations, and that I'm always going to be working around something, even if that something has nothing to do with my gear. If my gear performs flawlessly, there's still weather and all kinds of unpredictable, uncertain things that can have very serious physical implications, like when you're climbing, or more recently, I've been logging. I've been doing industrial timber harvesting here with my brother, and both from a desire to do that work, because it's awesome work outside, very physical, beautiful here in the Appalachian Mountains in Western Virginia. And also because it's something that I wanted to shoot, and it's a really engaging and unique way to live and to work. It's very, very demanding, very hard, but it's also beautiful, and I wanted to capture that. And so what better way to kind of bring the GH5 down and kind of throw it right out of the frying pan and into the fire and see how it does. So that's a little bit of kind of where I'm coming from. And one of the things that I've noticed in the discussion of the GH5 is that a lot of people, you know, it was hyped so much, and so many of the features were so, in some ways, overblown, you know, because the 4K, 60p, the slow motion 4K, it is really impressive. It's awesome. My brother burnt his lower field, which I think is like 17 acres, and kind of wildfire, just like burnt the whole field off in 20 minutes. It's really epic. I took the GH5 down there and I shot it, and I'm really excited about that video, and being able to have that video slow motion in 4K. Very, very cool. But the problem is that it's a tool. Like any other device or any other camera, there are certain situations and certain things that it does really well, and other things that it doesn't do so well. By now, you have probably heard that there are a handful of people that are disappointed with the autofocus on the GH5. Now, let me say that the extent to which you rely on or need autofocus that is bulletproof, that varies from person to person. Different people need more out of their autofocus. Other people think they need more out of their autofocus and just don't want to or don't know how to work around it. Not saying that that's always an answer, and I'm not saying that, you know, you're lazy or bad. This isn't a criticism. I'm not saying any of this as a criticism of people. I'm just saying that it's important to understand the different. Yeah, I am kind of a lumberjack now. At least, you know, kind of like the Monty Python sketch. I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay. But yeah, I am doing this. Hopefully, I would love to incorporate this into my work flow that I do, just because I enjoy how opposite timber harvesting, how opposite that is from social media and trying to like freelance as a creative. It is the exact opposite. You don't have to explain to anybody how important your work is or why they should care. You don't have to sell anything. You just show up and then work your ass off, and that's it. And you make a little bit of money and you get to spend days outside cutting stuff up, pushing stuff around with a bulldozer. You know, pros and cons. But back to the GH5, yeah. It's something that, you know, the autofocus is something that different people weigh differently in their options. And I think that there's a tendency to assume that the autofocus was going to be as awesome as all of the other features. And I've gotten some flack for refusing to diminish the value of all the other things that this camera does so well because of the fact that the autofocus is immature. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. So I also shoot with the Fuji X-T2, which right out of the box, the autofocus on the X-T2 was deplorable. It was hunting everywhere. It was breathing in the background. So it was like the foreground part on the face when you're just like talking to the camera. It would always be kind of like going back and forth and couldn't find focus, couldn't stick. And then the background was always going in and out of focus and breathing. It was very distracting, very difficult to use in that regard. And so, you know, that was actually just fixed with a recent firmware update, and now the Fuji X-T2 is quite good. Not quite as good as Sony, which I think that Sony is, at least in terms of 4K autofocus, within $2,000 give or take in price range. I am not aware of any cameras that are better in autofocus for 4K within $2,000, like in the below $3,000 that are better than Sony. And that I don't shoot with Sony cameras. I have a Sony RX100 Mark IV that I like for certain things, but I am not invested in a Sony system, and I wouldn't invest in Sony because autofocus is one thing. It is one tool, and it doesn't make or break a camera for me, for the way that I shoot, and that may be different for different people. In my videos, I've tried to show the autofocus as accurately as I can and not like cover for it or hedge around the fact that, yeah, the autofocus, actually in one of my videos where I was talking, my first impressions video, which again, a lot of people fail to read the first impressions part of the title of my video, that it's like, this is my first impressions of the video. My first impression of the autofocus of the GH5 was that it was actually quite good because right out of the box is better than the X-T2. With one firmware update, the X-T2 has surpassed the GH5, which gives me hope for the GH5 because the GH5 is starting out better than the X-T2 did. And here's what I mean. What I didn't notice about the autofocus on the GH5 is that it was keeping my face in focus, but there was breathing and pulsing in the background, which could be distracting. And I was looking predominantly at kind of like, okay, is my face in focus or not? And so I didn't notice, you know, some of the stuff that was going on in the background. I was a little overly enthusiastic about it. Wrote about kind of my realization there in the description below, talking about that. And then, you know, some people took me to task for that, and that's fair enough. I mean, I'm giving my first impressions of what I'm seeing. But one of the folks in the audience here, and his name slips my mind off the top of my head, but the way he said it made a lot of sense to me in the way that I use a camera, which was that, you know, the autofocus is far from perfect, but it does a much better job than I can do. So for a frame of reference, the video that I shot yesterday where my brother was burning down his field, and it's this very epic, and I mean, it was, I don't know how to explain how hot it was, but it was hot as hell. Like, I mean, you have a field of grass that goes up like that, and you're standing, you know, 15 feet away from it, and you run back and you're like 20 feet away, and you're shooting and you're zoomed all the way in trying to still get good footage, and then like the heat just washes over you, just like a blast. It's incredibly powerful. And, you know, I have all this stuff going on and trying to shoot and do all that stuff at the same time, and I used autofocus for much of that video. I also used manual focus at some points too, and basically the way I looked at it, the way I assessed it in my mind was, if the autofocus is doing a better job than I could do with manual focus, then, you know, and having that situational awareness to say, this is the time for autofocus versus this is the time for manual focus, which, in short, the way it seems to me is that if you're doing like talking head interview type shots, which I also did because I interviewed my brother as part of this video, which you'll see if you're subscribed to this channel. You'll see this video in a couple of days once I put it out, probably Thursday. Next week is what I'm aiming for, to have it all edited, like a little mini doc about kind of my brother and his forestry quest here. They actually burned down the field to bring back a species of quail that used to inhabit this area in Western Virginia, but it's gone now. So it's all ecologically, you know, connected and responsible, and very interesting in a way. But doing that interview footage, I had it initially on autofocus, and, you know, it was hunting because it was in low light, and it was just, the autofocus wasn't doing a great job. Switched it to manual focus because in the low light, low contrast situations, especially those where there is very small movements, like little back and forth stuff, sometimes it's not so much that it loses the face, it's more that it pulses or breathes in the background. Depending on how everything is laid out, that may or may not be noticeable, that may or may not be detrimental in something where you're covering it with a lot of B-roll. And so for those of you guys who might not be familiar with B-roll, and I am going to do a video or series of videos about some of the basic filmmaking terminology that I use and that I think could be helpful. From some of you who have expressed that desire for me to do that, I'm looking forward to getting a decision made about this camera so I can stop doing videos about it, but I'm always answering questions about it, which I'm happy to do too. So it's like, it's good to have a lot of videos in the hopper, in the queue. But you know, with B-roll, it's like you have a talking head shot here, and then maybe, you know, you have another scene where you lay the visual over top of the audio, so that, like, instead of seeing my face here talking, you're seeing, you know, the field burning while you're hearing the audio from this clip, and the B-roll is what is laid over top of that, the visual that doesn't match the audio, but it kind of covers the visual, so that, you know, if the autofocus is hunting on this video, you're not having to watch the camera hunt, you're watching a different shot that looks nice, as it sounds like I'm narrating this. And this is something that happens all the time in filmmaking, and sometimes by design because you just want to get those shots in. Other times it's, and I think frequently it's because, you know, as an editor, you want to hide your mistakes or hide the, you know, kind of the rough corners and the edges. And so there definitely were spots like that when I shot that video with the GH5 where the autofocus wasn't doing a better job than I was, but that's when it was up to me to say, okay, I need to use manual focus for this situation. And vice versa. There were some times when I was using manual focus and I was just like, I can't keep up with this because there's too many things going on and it's too crazy. Like, I just, you know, throw it in autofocus continuous, let the camera take over. And in many cases, like, that worked, and it worked enough to get long enough clips to be very usable, to look really, really good, to the point where I was very favorably impressed with it. Now, again, it still has its shortcomings, still has its problems, and I think that a lot of people want autofocus to be like an autopilot where it's completely autonomous as opposed to automatic. And it does automatically focus, but it's not completely autonomous in the way that it acquires focus, keeps focus, and moves that focus around and follows it. There are flaws. There definitely are problems. I think a big part of the question when people complain about autofocus also is in comparison to what. So, one can certainly argue, and I would admit myself, that Sony has the best autofocus that I am aware of anywhere near this price point. But when you look at the other problems or shortcomings or limitations that Sony has with its system, some people don't mind that. Some people really, really need autofocus. And, if somebody was like a wedding photographer and was like, I need to be able to have really good autofocus, I wouldn't recommend that they buy the GH5 for the autofocus. If you have a whole host of things that you're buying a camera for, then fine, because there's enough meat on the bone with this camera where it's very valuable and it does so much so well. And I think it's fairly reasonable to say that in a reasonably short amount of time, in the next year or so, this autofocus is going to get tuned up via firmware to the point where it may not be quite where the Sony is, but it's going to be significantly better than how it looks right now out of the box. And right now out of the box, yes, it is a limitation, but it doesn't stop me from getting footage that I'm proud of, that I'm happy with, and in many, many cases, it does a better job than I can in manual focus. Now, some would probably rightfully argue that has something to do with my not being great at manual focus, but that's something that every person has to weigh for themselves in terms of like how they weigh or prioritize autofocus. So, having kind of given you my thoughts on the strengths, weaknesses, shortcomings, etc. of the GH5 in terms of that one particular thing, I think it's a great camera, and I don't think that it is appropriate for everybody. I wouldn't recommend this camera to everybody. I think that there are some people that think that a more expensive camera will give them more expensive looking quality stuff, and you can still do really bad stuff with a really expensive, really nice camera. It is very complicated to use relative to many other cameras. The autofocus and a lot of that stuff, it takes still a pretty high amount of situational awareness to apply the tools and the power and the engineering that's in this camera. It takes a lot of, attentiveness to apply those things really well, and skill and time to learn how to do that with this camera specifically. And I'm not claiming to have all of those skill sets completely nailed down by any stretch, but I'm just trying to report what I have learned as I go. And frankly, I've been kind of comparing this because it's this versus the X-T2 for me, because I need a camera that shoots stills at a high level of quality and video at a high level of quality. And so kind of moving the conversation a little bit strictly from autofocus, and if you guys have questions about autofocus, please jump in and let me answer them. I'll be more than happy to, but I've said mostly what I could think to say about the autofocus. In terms of the stills, one of the things that in my previous videos I talked about the stills being, I wasn't super excited about them. Well, got some advice from some of the commenters, and that's why I appreciate you guys taking the time to comment on these videos. The vast majority of you guys are not trolls. Thank you for being nice, civilized, decent human beings, compassionate and all that. And I often learn a great deal from the people that comment on my videos, why I always am encouraging that conversation. Good question, Queen of San Joaquin, about the G7 versus the GH5 autofocus. Yes, the G7 autofocus is bad. I mean, it's like comparative, even like kind of if you take a mean average of like all across like the different cameras, it's definitely on the low end. I would say that the GH5 is noticeably better than the G7 in autofocus. And so that's part of the reason too why I gave it the thumbs up, and I said, yeah, I'm impressed by this autofocus. On my first pass watching the video before I edited it, it was because of the fact that I noticed the AF was definitely better than the G7, so that was a good sign. And I believe, by extension, having not shot personally with the GH4, because I believe that the G7 and the GH4 are about the same in terms of autofocus, that the GH5 is at least starting out ahead of the GH4, just right out of the box. And that it, you know, there are many people who film low light weddings and other fairly demanding situations. They film with GH4s as like one of their main cameras, and they've, you know, worked around that. And so I think that that is something that is, you know, it is noteworthy. It's worth mentioning. But yeah, objectively, if you compare it to the high end, which Sony is that high end in terms of autofocus, nope. Sony, like if autofocus is why you're buying a camera, you got the wrong camera if you bought a GH5, at least at this point. I am fully confident that they're going to fix it and tweak it, given what Fuji has done with the X-T2, and it started off very similarly. And Fuji isn't even video heavy in its investment in the platform. Panasonic is a video camera, and they know that they know that that's what their competition is, and that's what they're up against. My assumption is that they figured we have enough meat on the bone with this camera where, you know, people can still do awesome stuff with it, and we'll bring that autofocus up to speed and improve that as we go along. And to my mind, given everything that's in this camera, you know, I think that's a fairly reasonable position that they have taken. In terms of the still images, though, that was another area that I saw initially as being a weak spot. Got some very good beta, some advice from some of you guys on the channel here who commented and were like, hey, don't jump to conclusions, just get a faster lens. And I was like, okay, well, I'm comparing a slower lens on the GH5 against a slower lens on the Fuji. Slow lens versus slow lens, like it should be roughly the same, should be roughly equivalent. They convinced me to go out and, you know, convinced me to play to its strengths. So I actually got a Olympus, a little 25, which is a 50 millimeter equivalent, a 25 millimeter f1.8, not the fastest lens that's ever out there. You know, there are faster lenses, but I have to say, and if you haven't already subscribed to me on Twitter, I'm going to share these photos out on my Twitter stream. Like I said earlier, I don't share all of my kind of test photos on my Instagram, just because I'm trying to curate a little bit more of a consistent look and feel there. But the changes that I've noticed having switched to a faster lens on the GH5 is that the difference between the Fuji in terms of the quality that I can achieve in even low light situations, to my eye, and again, there are many people, and like my heart is still with Fuji. My heart is still with Fuji. Like I love the Fuji X-T2. I love the way it feels. I love the way it looks. It is a sexy camera. It is a beautiful camera. It has my heart. However, I do not have the bank account at this point, which is part of the reason why I am delving into the wonderful world of logging. You know, I don't have the bank account to facilitate having multiple cameras that each do kind of half of one camera's job. And what I have found, and again, this is not a final outcome, final decision, because after I'm done down here, I've got another week working down here in Virginia and shooting and testing and all that. Lee Carswell says Panasonic released an official statement in regards to the AF. They pledged to improve it. That's great to hear, Lee. Thank you for sharing that with me. I am not surprised to hear that, and I believe that it's going to be good eventually. And it's not bad right now. It's just right now it's good, not great, is how I would describe it. You know, I think a lot of people are disappointed because a lot of people heard about everything else that was great about the GH5 and they expected great all the way across the board. And the truth is, autofocus is good, not great. It is not bad. It doesn't suck. And a lot of people are like, you know, just like, oh, the camera's a complete piece of crap. Like the autofocus is bad. It's like, well, dude, look at everything else that this camera does really, really, really well. Way better than the Sony cameras. Like, doesn't make this a better camera than a Sony camera, because some people might need the features that Sony does really, really, really well, right? So in terms of the low light though, against the X-T2, what I found is that faster glass it makes a difference. It makes a big difference. I mean, duh, right? Everybody knows faster glass makes a difference, but you know, the comparison, letting the camera play to its strength is really what it comes down to. It's like Fuji with a larger sensor and having a reputation for being better in low light. It can sort of muscle its way through slower glass and deliver brighter, sharper, arguably better images with less to work with. With the GH5, you have to kind of play to its strengths a little bit and put a prime lens on there that's faster. Now, here's the other half of that, because yeah, I don't want to carry around another lens, but while the GH5 is a bigger camera, it is also, the lenses are also much smaller. So the Fuji has some small lenses, but like the 16mm and the 56mm, like the portrait and the wide angle lenses for the Fuji are big and they are heavy. This lens is like, you know, it's tiny. It's a tiny little lens, and you know, a 1.8. I was out shooting tonight. I was shooting pictures of my brother's daughters and the cats. I did some night shots even, like with stars and some flowers and some other things that I'm really excited about showing you guys. Again, follow me on Twitter. That's where I'm going to be showing these images, and eventually they're going to make it into these videos when I compile a full-on comprehensive review of the GH5 to illustrate this point. But I had no complaints looking at those images, at least not to the point where I could justify keeping two separate cameras for that. Like, the difference in the image quality went from being like noticeable, small, but small, large enough to be significant, to being like not that much. Forked Film says G85, the photos are lacking a bit. I had the G85 as well, and I tried that, and it was a similar thing where I felt like the photos were a little bit behind. And even the G85, when I tried putting faster glass on it, I wasn't loving the photos out of it either. And that's part of the reason why I was skeptical about getting a faster lens for the GH5, is because I was like, I already tried faster glass in the Micro Four Thirds, it doesn't do anything. I just put this on today, and it's beautiful. For video and ease of use, yes, it's fantastic. You know, the Sony A7 cameras, I have not shot with them personally. I think a lot of it comes down to what you need in terms of, you know, is it low light performance with just stills that you want? Is it low light performance overall? Like, how much of your shooting is low light? What's the cost going to be to you to change the lens ecosystem? Because the lens ecosystem is a big part of a decision to change with different cameras. The lens ecosystem is what brought me into Fuji, because I was looking at the Sony line, and aside from the problems that everybody was having with the overheating and the time limits and like all these, you know, different things in the battery life, the thing that really made me start thinking about Fuji was I love the lenses that I was seeing Fuji make. And frankly, if I didn't shoot any video and I could just afford to say, you know, I want good photos from the camera that I think feels the sexiest, Fuji, hands down, no question about it. You know, Panasonic, nothing against Panasonic or your engineers, guys. Stills with Sony and go with primes to save some cash. You know, I haven't shot a lot with the Sony. It would be really hard for me to say. I've seen some beautiful, beautiful shots with especially the low light shots. I think that the advantage of the Sony which Sony's, they have some bugs in the system, and I'm not familiar enough with Sony to be able to tell you why you should not buy one. I can tell you that at one point I did look very closely at Sony, did a lot of research, and I remember between the lens selection, issues with the price, the weight, the size, I felt like Fuji was a better value when I was looking for that same good low light quality in the still images. And with a good lens ecosystem, Fuji seemed like a better answer to me at that time. But I can't say, you know, that the Sony A7 is bad. All I would say is that for low light photos specifically, you know, if only a small percentage of what you shoot is low light, it may not be worth it to you, depending on your budget, to lay out a whole bunch of cash for something that is only going to be sort of one-dimensional, something that is a one-trick pony. Not saying that it's bad in the other things that it does, but just saying that the one area that makes it exceptional is low-light photos, and everything else, it's good, but you could probably find other cameras that maybe are smaller, cheaper, lighter, some combination of those things that do, you know, maybe as good as or even better job when you average all the different things that the camera does together. Again, if you're just buying it for that one feature, that's a different discussion. I hope that is maybe of some use. I know that's not the most straight across answer, and I might not be telling you anything that you don't already know. But yeah, I mean, to me, I'm not invested in Sony for just the way that I shoot and the things that they do well versus the things that they don't do so well. You know, our needs and what their offerings don't line up super well. But with the GH5 in the low light, I would say that yes, there is still a small advantage that goes to the Fuji, because the Fuji can, you know, take lemons and make lemonade, whereas the GH5, you got to start with something a little closer. You got to start with lemon juice to get to the lemonade. So you have to kind of give it a little bit more by maybe carrying a faster lens with you. So if you're shooting video, the whole like one lens solution that's going to do everything is not really viable. On my Fuji, I carried the 18 to 55 f2.8 to 5.6 or whatever it is. It's a stabilized lens. Of course, the X-T2 is unstabilized body, but that f2.8 lens, I could shoot literally anything, and like all the photos. Actually, Tuesday, I'm publishing the slideshow of the still images, the best still images that I shot while I was over in Oman and Dubai in the Middle East this winter. And almost all of them were taken on that one lens, which is one of their kit lenses. And Fuji makes amazing kit lenses. Like that's not something that a lot of companies do really well. Lee Carswell asked about recommendations for variable neutral density filters for video. That is a good question. I will give you what I do, and this is possibly a reflection of where I am in my process in terms of video work, but I went on Amazon and I looked around until I found something between $30 to $50 and that fit my lens, and I called it good. And so far I've used that on my Fuji for stills, I've used it for video, I've used it on the GH5 because I have a 58mm lens for, ironically, both the Fuji, and they share a lot of, you know, kind of, I have parallel systems almost in a lot of ways between the Fuji and the Panasonic, and so I just use that variable ND filter. I know you can spend more for one, and I think that, you know, there's some argument to be made that, you know, it's worth it at some point to get a more expensive ND filter. But having a variable ND filter is so helpful, because when you're out shooting and, you know, maybe before you go out and you're shooting, you get all the settings. You're going to be shooting in 24 frames per second, so you got 1/50th of a second shutter speed, and you get everything kind of dialed up. Then you go outside, you turn the camera on, you look through the screen of the viewfinder, and you're like, oh crap, everything is all washed out. Well, if you have a neutral density filter on there, you just go whoop, and you, oh, there we go, whoop, right, like that, imitating the noise that I make, as I always make that noise, very quietly, ideally, so it doesn't pick up on the microphone, that sound effect, as I rotate the variable ND filter to darken the image a little bit. And Griffin Hammond, his way of thinking about the variable ND filters is like sunglasses. That's the way he explains it. Sunglasses for your camera, where it just puts less light into the sensor. So if you're shooting in a really bright scenario, you can keep a slower shutter speed, but you can kind of gradually adjust so that it all looks good, and you don't have to mess with your aperture. You don't have to mess with any of the settings where you have to fumble around inside the camera. It's just completely external. You just turn it, make it dark. It's about, well, I have one other filter that I brought with me on this trip, and I have almost never used it, and that's like a softening filter for like kind of like a diffusing filter, so that like early morning light, when you get you know, kind of the sunlight breaking through the trees, that type of thing, that you can, it kind of creates that effect, softens things up and diffuses the light, basically, like I mentioned. So back to talking about and I hope that was helpful. If you guys have any additional questions about ND filters or anything, I will give you the information, insight that I have, but typically I don't, you know, I try to take the simplest, when I'm trying to learn about a new piece of gear or a new technique, what I do is I look at the most simple iteration, the cheapest, most straightforward way that I can employ that piece of gear or execute a technique. I do that until I find something lacking. And that's, Forked Films said, get an ND filter that matches your largest lens, and then get step-up rings for your smaller lens, and that's a very good tip. Up till this point, I only really use an ND filter on one main video lens that I have, which now that, because again, coming from Fuji, where my video was kind of relegated to only one lens, because the primes that I loved for stills really were not a good bet for video, because I'm shooting everything handheld predominantly in my line of shooting, and the primes are all unstabilized, so you're just going to get incredible shaky cam stuff. And also, one thing that I noticed too, reviewing a lot of the footage from what I shot in the Middle East that I'm still editing, a lot of like jello wobbly rolling shutter stuff, which is so frustrating, and it just breaks my heart, because the picture looks so beautiful, like the colors are so great, and then you get it in there and you look at it and you're just like, no, I wasn't, like, these things weren't all wobbly and made out of gelatin, and but the camera seems to think they are. So the rolling shutter in the X-T2 is a significant thing that in the GH5, and I know the GH4 was reputed to be very good in the rolling shutter department as well. The GH5, I mean, you can like whip the camera around and it doesn't jiggle and roll, like everything looks very good. But the other thing, kind of talking about moving the camera around, jiggling and rolling, etc., is that with the GH5, because of the Ibis, now shooting video on fast primes is something that is very much a viable option. It's a possibility now for me, because my stability is not coming from the lens itself, it's coming now from the camera. And so that gives me an increased range of circumstances under which I can favorably work. And so I guess kind of the bottom line that I'm getting at is that what I've noticed in terms of just technical advantages that of the X-T2, of the Fuji, the APS-C, larger sensor, all that notwithstanding, that from a technical standpoint, there are fewer and fewer things that I can look at and justify the cost of owning that system in addition to the GH5. And the unfortunate reality for me, I say unfortunate because again, I love my Fuji camera. I love the X-T2, but when it comes to like which camera does more stuff that I need it to do, and which camera seems to be covering more of my bases. Now, again, I have not done a direct head-to-head comparison, shot for shot, side by side, X-T2 versus GH5. I am going to do that when I get back to New York. When I get back to Massachusetts. I am back, with all my other cameras, because I specifically painted myself into a corner. I only brought the GH5 and 2 lenses. I actually have a third lens that is going to be coming, which is the portrait lens, a 45 f1.8 Olympus lens for this, because one of the complaints that I had, or one of the areas that I thought that the Fuji was better, was skin tones, portraits. And so I figured, you know, I'm going to get the cheapest reasonable portrait lens that I can. It was like $250 or something, which is not a lot for a tiny little lens. And again, that's an advantage that I have here, is the lenses are tiny, they are cheap, and you know, they are good. The glass is good. What I've seen, the results out of this little Olympus lens, I've never shot on an Olympus lens or an Olympus camera before in my life. I have no affiliation with them. I haven't even put them in my affiliate links in any of the channels. Like, I was very, very impressed, and the stuff that I was seeing as I'm editing the photos, it's like, yeah, if this came out of the X-T2, like, you know, same, like, it's very, very good, very good. But yeah, all that to say that, you know, what it feels like to me is that I haven't gone out there and been like, oh man, I missed that shot, I missed this shot, I missed that. This turned out poorly. If only I had my X-T2, I would have been able to get that. Hasn't, especially not since I put a faster lens on this, that has not happened once. There hasn't been a scenario in which I've been disappointed with the pictures that I've taken and been like, oh man, that looks kind of, I don't know. It's like, that hasn't happened. And to my mind, just because I love the feel, I love the look, I love the analog nature of the X-T2. It is a beautiful camera, beautiful camera. You know, I love it, and I want it to be as good in video as it is in stills, but it's not. And in stills, it's very good, but the amount of advantage that the Fuji has is over the GH5. And again, I'm sure somebody could either prove me completely right or completely wrong, depending on how you crunch the numbers. If you go into Lightroom or do some engineering and get into the physics, and like the angry photographer, I'm sure, like, you know, he'd probably call me all kinds of names, and his followers will come over here and etc. That's fine. Thank you, Jeff Hillbop. You see accurately where this is probably going, and I'm being totally honest when I say I have not made that decision yet. I'm still gonna like I'm trying to reserve my judgment, but thank you for your recommendation about the lens, because this happened because of you. And if you check out my Twitter, I actually posted a couple of pictures, or at least one picture, of the fire that I shot with one of these lenses. And yeah, great recommendation on the faster glass for the GH5 made a huge difference. And you know, yeah, the Fuji doesn't need the faster glass to do that. With a 2.8 lens, it can do the same stuff that the GH5 can do with a 1.8 lens. That's all well and good. But, you know, when you then factor in the whole video side, that's the one, like, Jenga piece that topples the whole tower. And it's like, yeah, the video stuff that I can do with this camera, it's just unbelievable. And I have one battery only. You know, and I've charged it once since I've been down here for like 3 days, shooting video, shooting photos, back and forth, on and off, just running all over the place. You know, it's a small thing. That's not a technological feature that it's like, that's not like 4K at 60p, but that is something that when you need to keep shooting and you know, don't have to change a battery every 30 seconds and like interrupt shots, and you know, those little things make a huge difference. That's a difference between getting a shot and missing a shot. And the one thing that I thought about was that, you know, I have no doubt in my mind that because of the Ibis, and because of the fact that there is virtually no, or very little to no rolling shutter with the GH5, you know, I was running around, literally running in fear of my life at a couple of moments. Maybe not in fear of my life, but where it was hot enough that I was like, I understand how people like just go boom like that, and they're just like incinerated, like in a really hot forest fire, you know, standing next to that field burning. It was just like nothing, then whoosh, like there's this huge, you know, convection of hot air. You know, I was focused on a variety of other things besides messing around with my camera, and the footage that I got, despite having to deal with distractions of my environment, The footage was really good, and yeah, a lot of it was in autofocus. A lot of times the autofocus does better than I can do. The autofocus is far from perfect, but I would say good, not great. Sony, great autofocus. GH5, good autofocus. It's not bad. If you were expecting great and you got good, you might be butthurt and say, oh, it sucks, it's terrible, it sucks ass. Like, I had somebody comment on one of my videos, oh, just throw that thing away and get a Sony a6300. And it's like, yeah, well, that's fine if all I needed was to be able to shoot 2 minutes at a time with perfect autofocus, and it does that stuff really well. I'm sorry, I got a little carried away there on my ranting there, because I really don't hate Sony cameras, and I have nothing against people that like them. They just don't fit my needs, and I'm still up in the air, frankly, about which way I'm going to go with the GH5, because my head is like, yeah, obviously GH5. You know, I was shooting night shots even that I'm going to post on Twitter, night shots that like full on like 15-second exposures, stuff like that. Beautiful, came out great. I was shooting handheld at ISO 200 in very dull twilight, shooting pictures of people, getting good skin tones, not getting noise, not getting anything bad, just like shaving that extra you know, number off of the lens aperture, that 2.8 versus 1.8. That 1.8, man, makes a big difference. Makes a big difference, and I'm, you know, hey, I gotta say, I'm impressed with it. And all that notwithstanding, there's part of me that, you know, I just love using the Fuji camera because it's a pleasure. But because frankly, you know, if in a perfect world, if I could put the Fuji sensor, well, I don't know if I would even do that. It's like I would want a hybrid between the Fuji X-T2 and the Panasonic GH5, where you take the strongest parts of both of those cameras, you put them together. That would be a badass camera that I would pay twice as well. I guess that, well, yeah, I probably would pay twice as much for that, because you get the same value as owning both of them, but in one consolidated package. So in a fantasy scenario, being able to have the X-T2 and the GH5 bring forth some hybrid offspring, that would be bitchin'. I'd be really excited about that. But in a scenario where I don't have the money to keep both cameras, you know, again, having shot a bunch with the Fuji X-T2 over the last 6 months, and loving it, loving shooting with the Fuji X-T2 and getting what I believe to be some really good quality images out of it. The advantage there is not great enough for me to say that it's like worth ignoring the disadvantages that it has, and especially compared to the major advantages that the GH5 has in other areas. So kind of sad, a little bit bummed about that, because I was kind of hoping that the X-T2 would win and that my life would be simpler. Although, truth is that these lenses are smaller and cheaper, and I probably will be money ahead in the long run to have one camera only that does everything that I need. And again, I am not saying, and I want to make really clear, because I'm kind of tired, and I want to make sure that I'm not bobbling the statement that I'm trying to make. I am not trying to say that the GH5 is this perfect camera that I recommend to everybody, or that it is somehow able to do everything that anybody wants it to. I am saying that for the way I shoot, for what my needs are, I realize that I'm probably poking the microphone and making awful problems in the audio. Sorry. Like I said, I'm a little bit tired. I don't think that is the end-all be-all in terms of cameras, but for the needs that I have, there's always going to be something that a camera cannot do. And the GH5, you know, it doesn't do certain things really well, like really low light. It's going to struggle in really low light. Autofocus, it's going to struggle with autofocus. But there are ways to work around that, and there's a lot of, you know, things that it does really, really well in between those points. And that's kind of the thing that I'm looking at, is if I have to take one camera that's going to do the vast majority of the stuff that I want, can I afford to sacrifice a little bit around the edges? Yeah. I mean, That's why I don't shoot with my full frame system, you know, because I don't need to be able to have like, you know, bokeh on every single shot that's so obscure that I can't see anything in the background. And like, you know, Jeff Halebop asks, have I tried the 6K photo function? I have not. You know, one of the things that I really like about the GH5 in terms of the stills, I love the shutter. Like it's got a very, and the Fuji does too. Like the Fuji has a nice shutter, but it's got a nice, like the shutter makes a nice sound. Like it's got a nice, and I know that this is like totally ridiculous thing to be talking about, but like it has a very nice like mechanical feel to it, like clunk, snap, thwack. I don't know what the right automata device is to explain how the shutter sounds on the GH5, but it sounds like a real camera. It doesn't sound like a piece of plastic. Like the G7, you know, it's kind of like this little like, you know, kind of digital click sound that's in there, and I don't know, maybe I had the sound settings wrong on the G7, and so I got a bad impression of it. But no, all that to say, I'm sorry, long answer. For no, I have not tried the 6K photo function yet. I have done some time lapse with this, and I was really happy. I actually animated some B-roll for a climbing movie that I shot, and I've been talking about it, and I'm like so close to finishing it, but I've been all hung up doing gear talk and then chopping down trees in my spare time that it's been, I have not finished that totally, but I think I'm going to try to finish that maybe this weekend. But I shot a little time-lapse sequence where I drew pictures to animate a bit of interview footage of an experience where I was talking about a kind of close call that I had during a climbing outing when I was in Canada last summer. So it was a good way to put that to the test and to you know, just sort of a different application for the GH5. I'm not really, I will probably try the 6K photo function at some point and then kick myself for not using it. For me, I like the idea of having, I don't know, I like being able to have that risk involved in taking a picture and picking a moment and identifying that, because I feel like without that, there's a certain element of the craft, and I know that this may sound incredibly pretentious, and I'm sorry if it does, but I sincerely feel this way, and it may be stupid, and this is probably why, you know, I'm pushing trees around with a bulldozer for a living instead of shooting photographs for a living, and, you know, I shoot the way I want to because it's for my artistic fulfillment, and to me, how I get that image matters as much as how the image looks and all the rest of the stuff. And I'm not saying that you know, that it's ethically impure or anything like that. I want to make that really clear. To me, I enjoy that like decisive moment of pushing that button and saying, okay, this is, you know, and the faster shutter speeds now almost kind of kill that to the point where, and that's what part of the reason why I like ripped on Sony a little bit for their, you know, releasing the RX100 Mark V and selling it like is like, oh, it shoots 24 frames per second for stills, and it's like, dude, come on, like if you need 24 frames per second, like, you know, either you're one of a handful of very, you know, a small number of professionals that are like really doing some cool stuff, in which case I'm sorry and I'll shut up, or you kind of might be missing some of the point. Jeff Halebop, I don't disagree with you. I probably will try the 6K photo mode at some point just because I haven't, and I'm curious. I hate having stuff on my camera that I'm like, even if it's stuff that I don't need to use, but like every now and then, I got to give it a whirl and try it. So I will do that, and I will report back to you. Maybe I'll try to do it by next Friday. So if you're here for next Friday's live stream, then I will report to you. Queen of San Joaquin asked me a question: what is my favorite camera of all time? Pardon my rude swilling of beverages on the air, but for whatever reason, I'm really tired this week. Maybe because I haven't been sitting and editing photos. I've been out in the woods a bit. But yeah, my favorite camera of all time, I mean, to be fair, I haven't used all that many cameras, but you know, I'll break it down into two categories. I would say film and digital. For digital cameras, um, you know, just from a personal standpoint, I would say probably the X100T by Fuji in terms of the digital cameras. There's something about it. Again, you can go and do engineering dissertations on why this is inaccurate, and I leave smarter people than myself to do that to their heart's content. To me, the question is not like, how does it look on paper? What do the numbers say? What does the DxO Mark review say? What does the angry photographer say in his analytics about, you know, the speed of light and how it travels and where it stops along the way? Like, to me, that stuff is secondary to when I am in a bind and there's something really significant happening. How reliably and how quickly can I get an image out of that that I am going to be happy with and that is going to mean something to me and to the other people that it's meant to be shared with? How quickly and reliably can that happen, and how simply and how easily can I reproduce that on demand when I need to? And certainly the physics, I'm not downplaying the, you know, any of the engineering or the physics. It's just something that that's part of the picture. That's not the entirety of the picture. And there's something about and it's harder to discuss things that are more metaphysical or that are a little bit more nebulous. And there's something about the X100T that, frankly, I felt was really, it allowed me to connect with people when I was shooting like street and documentary style stuff. That is something that I haven't been able to achieve in the same way with other cameras that are even only a little bit larger. It's just something about it. It just looked small and cute. And people looked at it and it's just like, oh, that's nice. You're pretending to be a photographer. Oh, that's sweet. You're taking pictures. Okay. You know, it's not something where people are like, I mean, even the GH5, this is not a huge camera, but this isn't a little like street photography camera where people are like, oh, is that a film camera? Like, this is a full-on camera. Like, when you're walking around with this, maybe, you know, you don't look like a professional to the extent that like a bird photographer does with his like huge 800 millimeter lens. But, you know, this is not a small camera. And like the X100T, there's something just very beautiful, simple, charming about it. I imagine the X100F is even better. I love the X100T. That was really the camera that got me to fall in love with photographing people, and that really allowed me to understand the amount of connection and the amount of relationship dynamic that you can capture in a photo with somebody, because everything else that I had been used to seeing and understanding, and really, like, I started to learn more about documentary and street photography when I became aware of the X100T. It's not that like that's the only camera that does that, but that's why I associate it with that, is those things came into my life at roughly the same time. And that's kind of why it holds a special place in my heart. In terms of film, the Nikon FE2, it's a workhorse, just a tank camera. Love it. You know, it's one of those things that is so forgiving despite my complete, or maybe not complete, but significant lack of real prowess in terms of film shooting. You know, the FE2, it's a simple, nondescript, not sexy camera that just does a great deal of what you ask of it, without too much fooling around. And I think, you know, for me, that should tell you something about the way I identify with or choose or select cameras, is that the simplicity of a camera does mean a lot to me. And that is still something that is part of the reason why I have not fully committed and just said, yeah, the hell with Fuji. I'm going to go with the Panasonic GH5 instead of the X-T2, because truthfully, the user interface and just like the feel of the Fuji camera is just so there's something about it that I love, that it's so intuitive and it just works for me, specifically for shooting stills. For video, it turns out it's a little bit more clunky for video. So, but that simplicity is a huge thing. Like, to be able to implement impressive technology that really works and that does amazing things, but to do it in a way that is simple and doesn't put the user out at the same time. That is what Fuji has done with their stills. And that's what I was hoping. I wanted to see that same level of performance and delivery on the video side that they had on their still side. And I don't quite think it's there yet. And I don't think that they can physically achieve that just through firmware updates. And I'm not saying that as a slam or a knock against Fuji, because I believe that, they've made really incredible strides in just this first iteration of a real attempt at a mature video. And I don't mean mature video, not like adult content. I mean like a technologically mature and developed video shooting system. And I have no doubt that, like, if they keep pushing at the same way that they've done with their photos, like, it took 3-4 versions of the X100 cameras to get to this camera, which is, well, I guess now the X100F, the 4th version, which is kind of like mature. And same thing with the, X-T2. This is, from a video or from a photos standpoint, it's pretty much a mature camera. Like, there's not a lot that they're going to be able to do that I could think of that I'm like, oh, this camera would be better if, it's, in terms of taking stills, it does everything you want and nothing that you don't want. And that part of the camera is, it's all grown up. The video side still has a way to go, and I don't think they're going to get it all the way there in this iteration of the camera. But who knows? Give them a few years. They put their minds to it. They could certainly, I think, figure out a way to, and I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about the GH5. Honestly, is that the GH5 has set the bar higher for other camera manufacturers, and that's good. Not because everybody should want to make a camera like the GH5, but they look at what is possible, or what Panasonic has done, and I think that incentivizes them to take their own technology in their own way and develop that to perform at a much higher level, again, in their own way that serves their own community. And that's what I'm hoping to see happen. And that's, I mean, frankly, if budget was not as big of an issue for me as it is right now, I would absolutely just keep the X-T2 and not regret it, not think twice about it. It is a fantastic camera. I love it. But when it comes down to saying I need one camera that does the most bang for the buck, and that's going to, give me the most value for the least amount of money, and that's going to be useful in the most amount of situations, I would have to be completely starry-eyed, head over heels in love with my X-T2, making a decision based purely on emotion to say that the Fuji X-T2 is going to be the better camera for my needs than the GH5. Again, not saying that the GH5 is a superior camera, saying it is a better fit for me and the things that I need it to do within my budgetary and use constraints. And I'm sorry, I know I'm always sounding like, legalese small print that I put in all the time, but I want to be thorough and interject these points because I know some people take issue with or misinterpret what I say, or think that I'm trying to foist over or recommend cameras to people for affiliate revenue or anything like that. And frankly, I've made more, I fed more trolls here on YouTube through being negative about cameras and being, being a little bit more pessimistic. And I think that when I actually do my full-on review of the GH5 properly, it's going to be, I'm going to focus more on the things that are problematic, because you don't need people to tell you the good stuff about a camera, right? Like, that's what the camera company does. You watch their promo video, they make a much better, much sexier video than I'm going to make, and they're going to tell you everything that it does really, really well. But you need somebody who's kind of clunky and obnoxious, hello, that's me, to tell you, yeah, this is the clunky, obnoxious stuff about this camera. that you're only going to realize after it's arrived, and that's when, you know, that's the stuff that's going to stick with you. Because the stuff that it does, and I say this all the time, you know, the stuff that a camera does well, the manufacturer tells you that right up front. You don't need to guess or figure that out. You know that. And then the stuff that it does poorly, that's the stuff that's going to stick with you for like months and months and months down the road. The good stuff just becomes normal. It's like, oh, it shoots 4K at 60p. Well, I expect it to do that. And so now that 4K at 60p, yeah, that's just normal. And it's become normal for me. And it's no longer this like, oh, it's so beautiful and amazing. But like the thing that it does poorly, it misses autofocus, you know, a few times in you know, an interview that you're shooting. It's like every day that's going to be brand new for you. That's never going to get old in a very, very bad way. So not saying that, you know, again, not going to repeat everything about my autofocus spiel. Personally, I think the autofocus is good, not great. And I think that that is a reflection of also, in, you know, addition to a number of things, that's also a reflection of the way that I use a camera and the priority that I place on autofocus, and that's going to be different for different people. Personally, I don't think that autofocus has to be autonomous and completely like perfect. And if you want that, then there's Sony. So yeah, that's what I have for you guys this evening. I didn't get a whole bunch of questions about the GH5, although I did kind of go on about it, and that might have meant that I was being really interesting and people didn't want to interrupt me. That might have meant that I was being very thorough, or that might have meant that I put a bunch of people to sleep and what have you. So that's fine either way. I enjoyed being able to share a little bit about this with you guys. I'm going to have more videos coming out, so if you haven't subscribed already, make sure you do that. If you don't follow me on Twitter already, you can find it, well, at Living Vertical is my handle, and once I update all of this with show notes and all that stuff, that's always down, all my social media stuff. But on Twitter, I'm going to be sharing out the pictures that I shot, the still images with the GH5. Got some really cool shots from down here in Western Virginia, and doing some burning, some forestry, and just kind of playing around in the low light with cats and all that stuff. Jose Billington asks me if I have any thoughts on Vlog for the GH5. I have not yet used that. For what it's worth, I haven't felt limited by not having it. I haven't been like, oh man, maybe I should get that. So haven't used it. I usually tend to overexpose, actually make it a little bit brighter than normal, and I'm still honestly trying to figure out kind of like what the sweet spot is. Typically what I'll do is shoot it just a hair brighter than what I want the end result to look like, and then that way when I put some grade on it, I use Film Convert Pro, their 4K version, and then when I do that, you know, the added contrast and all the rest of it usually gets me right about where I want to be in terms of the lighting. And then there's sometimes too, I found, like especially the 10-bit video files, like you can put a little bit more into them and you can manipulate them a little bit more in post, definitely, than like the 8-bit files. So it's not like night and day difference, but it's a little bit. It's like, you know, early afternoon, late afternoon difference. I'm sorry to use that analogy, that might not have worked, but yeah, I haven't used the Vlog yet. It is something that I'm interested in doing, but I want to make sure that this camera is worth it for me to keep without the Vlog before I, you know, get any other stuff like a battery grip, Vlog, or the, you know, XLR inputs or any other things. The only thing I did order is I did order another battery for it because I just want to see, you know, what I can do if I had 2 batteries. So those are my thoughts about that. If you guys have any other questions, I'm going to kind of start wrapping it up here, although I think I already did start wrapping it up, so I'm going to conclude my wrap up. Again, if you have any other questions, speak now, or forever hold yourself. All right, suits me. Hey guys, I really appreciate you all tuning in, taking the time. Believe it or not, it means a great deal to me, even though I'm kind of tired and rambling a little bit tonight, although I think I'm always rambling. It means a lot to me that you guys would take, half hour, 45 minutes, hour. Some of you guys stayed the whole 73 minutes that I've been going on here. Means a lot to have people do that. So, Jose, definitely let me know. Let me know how that works for you. And Forked Films, thank you very much as well. Like I said, nobody deserves an audience. And so the fact that I have you guys here to hang out with me on Friday nights, that I appreciate that. Ali, you're asking about GPS. GPS on the GH5, or is that a typo? If you have questions about the GH5, I'd be more than happy to answer them here before I sign off. Queen, sayonara, and you have a good evening. And I will have fun lumberjacking. It really is. It's more fun. It's really hard work, but it's also fun. It's in a kind of a strange way. It's a good kind of beat down. Okay, so Ali, you want to know if there is GPS tagging for the photos on the GH5? Am I understanding your question correctly? If that is where you're going with this, I can tell you. Thank you, Jose. I appreciate it if you do subscribe, and anybody else who's watching this after the fact, definitely subscribe. I'm going to be putting out more stuff about, well, not just about the GH5. I'm kind of excited to show you the stuff that I do with the GH5. Ali, in answer to your question about the GPS on the GH5, I don't actually use that function or that feature. I would be very surprised if it does not have it. Actually, let me I'm going to dive into the menu here. Let's see what we can come up with. This will be a good test. So it probably would be well, this is actually more of a test for me than it is for the camera, and there's a good bet that I am not going to be able to pass this test. Online manual, there's Bluetooth. Let's see. I mean, I know that this is probably the least satisfactory answer that I could give, but I am almost certain that this camera does, because I know a handful of cameras that are significantly less advanced than this that have GPS functionality enabled on them. I would be very surprised if it does not have it. Personally, that is a question I have never thought to use, because I just don't do that. Call it laziness, ill-preparedness, all of the above. I'm really sorry I don't have a better answer for you, but what I can do, I can look that up, find that information out, and get back to you. So when this video posts, if you just drop a comment and remind me, I will answer that for you hopefully sometime tomorrow. With a little bit more definitive information, then I'm sorry I don't know. But right now, I don't exactly know, and I don't want to steer you wrong on the camera. I would think that it does have geotagging, Jose said. So that's good. Awesome. So that's yes on the geotagging for the photos. I figured that it must have had that. I've never used that feature, so it's a good question. Even through the smartphone app, Jose says. Yes, the smartphone app, actually, and not to get off on another tangent, but I'm kind of starting one, so I'm going to roll with it. But the smartphone app for the GH5 is really good. And I mean, I'm a little frustrated. I love my Fuji. Again, I'm not bagging on Fuji, but their smartphone app, not great. With the Panasonic app, just about everything that you can do within the camera, in the body of the camera, you can do through the smartphone, and you can really fully control. It's a very, very robust app. There's a ton that you can do. And I don't need a remote control, or I don't have need for that, but it's really nice to know that I have that option, that if I wanted to, I could put the camera up on a tripod and really have full, solid working control of the GH5 through the app, because it's not like, oh, I can only control like these 3 things, but I can't control like that 4th thing that I really need. Like I can dig anywhere in and control. It's a very, very well designed app, and that's something that, you know, I've run into that wall on the Fuji, you know, with not being able to shoot 4K through their smartphone app, and there's nothing that tells you that you're limited to 720. It's like you think you're shooting 4K because the camera settings say 4K, and then you sit down, you shoot the thing, and then you go in and edit, and it's like, wait a minute, why does this say 720? Are the numbers wrong? Like, did I do something wrong? No, settings are all right on the camera. And then you dig through the internet and find out that, oh, that remote app that's supposed to work like a viewfinder is only good for up to 720, and that's kind of disappointing. At least that was my experience with the Fuji app. Although picture transfer and like the Fuji app does a lot of things really well, but it does a small number of things really, really well. Let me say that it doesn't do everything really well. And so that's something that's a little bit frustrating. At least, again, everything is in comparison with the Panasonic app. The Fuji app could stand to have a little bit more meat on the bone. So, all right, guys, I'm about done again. So yeah, thank you guys for tuning in. And oh, okay, got another AF question. Is it good enough for gimbal, pulling focus, steady cam? Oh, and there go my comments. Pulling focus for steady cam work? No, I would say no. That's my opinion. I don't think it's good enough for putting on a gimbal or steady cam. I mean, let me put it this way. I think if you did that, you would probably get, you know, like a 60 to 70% hit rate, and you would probably get, you know, that 30 to 40% miss rate. The question is, and again, it depends on the lighting, you know, and the settings and the fine tuning. In one sense, the fine tuning, I would say that, yeah, the A6500, it does seem like it is. Again, okay, so in one sense, like if it was something that was a longer type of event where I could weigh the battery life and the non-overheating issues of the GH5 against the autofocus performance of the A6000, you know, yeah, it is loaded. Absolutely. I appreciate that you recognize that. But it's a fun thought experiment, right? Like the 60% that you know, let's say 65% that the GH5 would hit on autofocus for video, maybe 70%, 75% even if it's bright, well lit, versus the, let's say, 90% that the A6500 from Sony would hit. You know, it kind of comes out even in some ways. In other ways, not even, but in some ways it comes out even if you think about it, because, like, you know, the battery life, the overheating, and all the other stuff that goes with the Sony, you'd have to change it out much faster. It has a shorter lifespan, or it's not going to be able to go nearly as long as the GH5. But the GH5, even though it hits a little bit less, the cumulative total of in-focus stuff that you're going to get, you know, you could work around it, I guess, is the point. In many cases, one could work around it if they wanted to or needed to. But in terms of autofocus, yeah, the A6500 is definitely superior to where the GH5 is right now. Compared to the X-T2 against the A6500, I would say that the A6500 is still better. I don't think it is way better. And I think when you compare the lens ecosystem on the Fuji and you compare the the responsibility that the company exhibits in terms of, giving really good high-value firmware updates, that and the lens ecosystem, I would say it's, to my mind, I like the X-T2 better, personally. But I also, being honest, I have a soft spot in my heart for the Fuji cameras, and Fuji has like the log option internally, where the Fuji does not have that. So there are definitely some trade-offs. I think that, though, in terms of pure autofocus, the A63 and 6500 are really, they're the top of the pyramid at this point. They're really good for that autofocus. I think the X-T2 is a close second, and I don't know about the rolling shutter between, like, the rolling shutter on the X-T2. I haven't heard a lot of people complain about that, but the more I've looked at handheld footage from the X-T2 that I've shot, that was really good looking footage until I made the mistake of panning ever so slightly and everything turned into jello. Then I was like, wait a minute. I don't know if the A6500 shares that same problem, and I believe that some of that problem arises because of the fact that it has a bigger sensor and it's harder to eliminate. And I could be totally wrong about this. If somebody else knows and could confirm or deny this, but what I have heard, and I'm under the impression that a larger sensor is harder to really dial in autofocus, and that it's also harder to eliminate rolling shutter. I don't know if that is entirely accurate or not, but frame rate has a lot to do with that, says Steve. Yeah, so one of the things that I've really appreciated about the GH5 is that there is virtually no noticeable rolling shutter, whereas the X-T2 is just jelly all the time, and that was hard to work with. So Steve, what you're saying is that there's more rolling shutter or less rolling shutter the higher or lower you go with a frame rate, just so that I understand what the correlation is between frame rate and rolling shutter. 60p, you'll get less of that stutter effect on pans because you're shooting more frames. Okay. And does that count, like the stutter is definitely one thing, but like what about like the wobble? Because that's the thing that, and maybe I'm using the wrong term, maybe rolling shutter isn't the right way to explain it, but like when, like with the Fuji, when you pan, and maybe it's all part of just a different manifestation or a different way of expressing the same thing. Maybe it's because I definitely have seen like a stutter where I pan and it just looks like everything falls apart, and I'm like, what's going on? And there again with the X-T2, because you can only shoot a higher frame rate at 1080, it's, okay, so the rolling shutter is different from the jello, and 60p won't help the jello. Fair enough. Yeah, for whatever it's worth, the 4K 60p eliminates or helps the rolling shutter, which even at 24, the rolling shutter is very much like not a thing on the GH5. It's not present. Plus, the jello effect is not there too. So, again, those are some benefits that might make the GH5 worth a look for some people, depending on how you shoot. If you struggle with that, shooting handheld most of the time with the X-T2 and stuff, I can definitely say that I've struggled a lot with the rolling shutter and the jello wobbly stuff, and it's so frustrating when you have this shot where you travel literally halfway around the world to shoot this thing, and you're like, this shot is awesome, and you're watching it in the camera, on the viewfinder, and you can't see any of the stuff that's not great in there. You can't see any of those effects. And then you put it on the computer and you look at the shot and you're all excited because, like, I went halfway around the world to get this shot. It's going to be amazing. And you look at it and you're just like, oh, so bad. It's incredibly frustrating. But yes, Steve, your point is very well taken, and it's one that I often forget about because I get like caught up in what's going on, and I'm just like winging my camera around, and I'm thinking to myself as I'm shooting, I'm like, don't be an idiot. Don't be an idiot. Like, my future self is talking to me and saying, like, slow the hell down. I am going to, like, kick you in the teeth if you give me a bunch of awful footage that is just shaky and like swinging the camera around and the pans are going to be messy. And then I'm thinking to myself, no, future self, like, shut up. I'm doing a great job. I'm keeping the camera really, really steady. It's going to be fine. What are you worried about? You're always so paranoid. And then, you know, future self gets that footage that past self shot, and then currently, I guess that would be present self, and it's just like, past self is an idiot. He didn't listen to me when I told him to just slow down and go a little bit more carefully on those pans because everything was going to fall apart. And now look what I got to work with. That's what happens, a little, multiple personality rendition of kind of what happens in my head with shooting. So there's a certain thing that, yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, Steve. I have actually video that I shot from, it wasn't India, it was Oman and Dubai. Tuesday, I have the still image slideshow that I shot with the X-T2 that's going to post. And then I have yet to edit, I've been kind of like kicking that can down the road, the video portion that I shot, mostly the same scenes because I was doing photo and video with the X-T2. And, I've looked through a lot of the video, and a lot of it has been just incredibly, like, it's like this close to being amazing, and then it's just that little bit of shake, a little bit of jello, just these little flaws that naturally manifest when you're shooting handheld video that turned out to be the turd in the punch bowl. And it's heartbreaking because the video just like beautiful in so many cases, like the Fuji colors, the glass and the colors are just fantastic. But even that's with an OIS lens, that's not even shooting on the primes. So it's like, it's kind of like so close but so far away, where you just love the Fuji video and the rendition, but you just, what it requires to actually achieve that look in a usable clip is much more involved than what the small, compact, quaint little cute size of the camera would imply. Whereas the GH5, it's a bigger camera, but it's a camera that also doesn't need, it's this kind of a standalone camera, whereas the X-T2, I could use that. No, in answer, Steve asked if the OIS with the Fuji is as good as Ibis and other cameras. No, absolutely not. Unfortunately, I mean, to be fair, I have not used Ibis in the Sony cameras, and so I think that it is harder to get effective in-body image stabilization with the larger the sensor is. I think the less effective the stabilization will be, just because everything gets complicated. Again, my very non-scientific way of explaining everything that I know about engineering cameras. The larger the sensor gets, the harder it is to do that witchcraft and make the sensor do stuff like that. So I haven't used the Sony to see what their Ibis is like. I've heard that their in-body image stabilization, or Ibis, is not that great. And I think that a lot of that has to do, at least my understanding, like I said, is because of the sensor size. The Ibis that the G85 and the GH5 and the GX85 have, the Ibis on the GH5 is dead quiet. The G85 was, and I hope I didn't just say that wrong, the GH5 is it's undetectable in terms of noise or audio feedback. The G85 was kind of noisy from the outset, and then they fixed that with a firmware update, but it's it's noticeable. Like you can shoot walking footage, and again, like if you're just like clopping and plodding around like a caveman, lurching about, the Ibis isn't going to save you. One of the things that I've noticed is that the Ibis isn't really tuned for walking, and so like you have to vary your gait a little bit. But if you kind of step lightly and don't mind looking like you're flouncing a bit, you can actually dampen a lot of the movement in your stride and really get super usable, really good looking moving footage due to the Ibis. It's like I have you know, yeah, Groucho Marx, exactly. Walk like Groucho Marx. You know, looking at the footage that I shot with the GH5 yesterday when we were down burning the field, my brother's field. I don't know, Steve, if you were here earlier when I was telling about. Right now. I'm actually in Virginia helping my brother doing commercial logging, and he's a forester. And we burnt down his field. It was 17 acres of like grass. Tall grass, and it went up in about like 15 minutes, and incredibly hot. And so I was literally running and gunning and getting like, you know, feeling like my eyebrows were going to get taken off, which didn't happen. Fortunately, everything's still intact. But I was literally running and gunning, and like the Ibis, there was a bunch of spots where the Ibis definitely like made a big difference, like where there's still a little bit of camera movement, like you can tell that it's handheld, but it's still totally usable. It's not like it smooths enough of it over to the point where it just looks like documentary style. Like it doesn't look like ass. It just looks like, okay, like this is something that we can work with for the most part, you know. And so it adds some forgiveness. It adds some margin of error into the whole thing that very meaningful. Yes, I'm shooting with the GH5 down here. I left my Fuji and like all my other kit at home. Said I'm going to bring it down here. I'm going to shoot the logging stuff. That was the first real like video that I shot down here, was burning off the field, and I'm going to edit that over the next couple of days and put that out. And then I want to do at least 1 or 2 days at the job site. It's like small scale logging, so it's not like clear cut type stuff, but it's a demanding environment, and it's pretty visually stunning, like to be kind of in the middle of that. Like I've been running a bulldozer, you know, which my brother very trusting, I appreciate. He's willing to let me drive around his bulldozer. Yeah, it is very hard work, and I can only imagine what it's going to be like trying to bring the camera into that environment. I figure it's going to be a good test. It's going to, which so far everything that I've done with it, I feel like it has, like, this camera is a blue collar camera. You know, it is not sexy and like, you know, the CEO of the camera world, like maybe the Leica, or maybe, you know, I might be off on my analogy a little bit here, but like the Panasonic is kind of the overworked middle class blue collar, like go out and, you know, put in 60 hours a week, and you know, it's a very hard working camera, and I think that it deserves a lot of appreciation and respect for what it can do and its durability and versatility, frankly. Because even with the stills, I was very much like Team Fuji, and like I can't, you know, commit to the GH5, and I still haven't fully made this decision, because one of the things I'm going to do when I get back home is I am going to do like a shot for shot comparison shootout between the GH5 and the X-T2 to really see what the difference is, and for my own benefit, because I have to get rid of one of these cameras. I can't keep them both. But yeah, agreed, Steve. It is an incredibly dependable camera. It's not the best with the AF, and you have to just kind of stack that in your list of priorities. You know, in trying to make the decision, really the one big shortcoming that I was struggling with as far as the GH5 was low light performance and still image quality, like together. And I got some faster little Olympus 25mm f1.8, and you know, it made a world of difference. Honestly, like the shots that I'm taking, and I am putting them out on my Twitter feed over the next several days, because I don't usually, the shots that I put on my Instagram are more kind of like in a theme, and right now I'm still way in the middle of my trip to the Middle East stuff. That's what's on my Instagram, and I'm not gonna get the free space in the queue to put the GH5 shots for like weeks down the road. So Twitter is kind of where I put the test stuff right now, just so that you guys can see what I'm shooting with it. But man, just with a, you know, adding faster prime lens, which is now stabilized because of the Ibis. So now theoretically, if I wanted to, I could have that same, like, you know, shallow depth of field on video and the low light performance and all the rest of it, and it's tiny. It's a tiny little lens, and so the improvement in performance has been so significant just by, you know, going from f2.8 to f1.8 with the GH5 that now, you know, justifying keeping the justifying keeping both cameras or keeping the X-T2 over the GH5, it's really, really hard to do. Steve, to your comment about the, you know, Panasonic knowing that the autofocus was going to piss a lot of people off with the GH5, I think you're right. I think that the way they looked at it, there's so much meat on the bone that people whose, and I know this is going to sound really, yeah, well, Jeff says, wait till I get a 1.4 lens or a speed booster to get it to 1.1. Probably not going to use a speed booster because I hate putting third-party stuff on cameras. But if I get I guess the 12 millimeter 1.2, if I ever get like $1,300 to burn, that Panasonic Leica, that'll be happening, because it's pretty sweet. But yeah, I just don't like the third-party stuff because a lot of times it doesn't have autofocus with it, and so it makes it harder for me to switch back and forth between stills and video. If I'm only shooting video, then a speed booster is great, but a lot of times it messes up the AF for switching back and forth between stills. But because I had a speed booster that I used, excuse me, with my G7. It was one that Caleb Pike recommended, the Roxen speed booster for like 90 bucks or something. It's made in Taiwan, I think. Great, works beautifully, you know, for manual focus video lenses, and they make all different models of that. But Steve, to your point about the autofocus and Panasonic kind of, you know, crapping the bed by releasing the camera with good, not great autofocus, I think that I can't speak to what their assumption would be, but what I think that a lot of it has to do is, to them, they say, okay, autofocus, okay, who's the next best autofocus, or who's the top of the pile in autofocus? Well, that's the Sony a6500. Okay, well, let's compare everything else about the camera and not just the autofocus and see how the two cameras stack up. And when you do that, suddenly, you know, the GH5 is like very obviously on the top of the stack in terms of, you know, just strictly in terms of features. You know, again, there may be somebody who really needs the AF, and so then that might tip the priority there. But like if you look at the 10K, or I'm sorry, the 10-bit 422 in camera, who else has that within the $3,000 price range? Like nobody has that. 60p 4K, nobody else has that. You know, with the really beefy weatherproofing and all that other stuff, like you stack all of this stuff on top of each other, I think they figured, you know, there's enough meat on the bone to get it out there, to get people excited about it, and then we'll, you know, we'll improve it down the road. Steve, your question about, there's a couple of points that you made. Number one, you're right, it does have everything to do with the way the camera interprets the background and how it sees things, and a lot of times I think it may come down to contrast detect versus phase detect, and again, I don't know enough about the engineering to say how far they can push a contrast detect system, and I have heard some people speculate that Panasonic has kind of reached the end of their tether there. So it'll be interesting to see. The way I look at it is, if you understand the limitation, you look at it as a tool and you say, this is something that I can use in these type of settings, in these types of situations. And if you know what to look for, then it's okay. You know, you're not going to get caught with your pants down. You're going to be able to get the stuff shot the way that you need it. And, you know, in some cases, yeah, you might have to do a little extra work to get around that. And, you know, for me, that's okay. The way that I shoot, the autofocus is not that high of a priority. And what I would have to trade in order to get better autofocus by getting a Sony a6500, everything that I would trade, not only in terms of just the specs, but just the economy, like of, you know, the glass and stuff. It's really hard, you know. And yeah, critical AF, Sony, Fuji, you know, and again, all of those cameras, the Sony and the Fuji, they all have their own limitations and their own shortcomings that you have to work around too. So it's like, it's hard, but I think you got to use your brain. And I don't mean this to you personally, Steve, and I don't mean this to be condescending. I mean, honestly, like I say this to myself, like it's hard to use our brains when we're buying cameras because there's a certain extent to which the marketing is very strong. Yeah, I would love to keep both the Fuji and the GH5. I mean, I'm loaded with credit card debt at the moment. Although once you get to a certain point, it's like, you know, it's like your lower extremities are crushed and you can't feel anything from the waist down. So it's like, yeah, throw on a few more pounds, like who cares? And I'm tempted to do that, or at least, you know, drag my feet in terms of getting rid of the X-T2 if that's what happens. And I'm not saying I'm going to do that, but I'm just saying if, because again, I'm playing with the idea. But, you know, we put a lot of our identity as like creatives, aesthetic stuff matters to us. And so marketing is that much more tangible and powerful when it's around a thing that produces its own imagery that isn't just like, oh, we made a cool video, but we're making a cool video about something that's going to help you make cool videos. And there's like a whole nother layer to that marketing and the extent that it pulls on us. And to an extent, we, I think, have some identity in our equipment. You know, it's like being a Fuji shooter is something that it's like, ooh, you shoot Fuji, okay, well, that's kind of weird, what's wrong with you? Or like, oh, that's kind of cool, like, you're awesome. Like, you know, like different people see different brands or like, ooh, Leica, you must be a pretentious jerk who's loaded with a bunch of money. Or like, maybe you're somebody who appreciates classical stuff, or like you really are a minimalist and you're like a craftsman and like old world. Like, you know, different people take different things away from different brands, and I think that we internalize a lot of that stuff too. And I know I do. You know, I try not to, but you know, when I'm looking at the X-T2 versus the GH5, my brain, it's a very clear, clear-cut decision. It's like, what camera does more stuff better? That's what it comes down to. But yet I'm still having to go through a big deliberative process because I want to find a way for the camera that I feel more emotionally connected to, that I identify with more. I want to find a way for that camera to actually be the one that also happens to be, you know, it's like I want to find a way to, you know, find a supermodel who is also going to be like a great mom and a great partner that I can take home to my parents, and who's also going to be like the best supermodel in the world and just so beautiful and like drop dead gorgeous, who also like tolerates my habits and all the things that I do wrong and my flaws and the fact that I'm, you know, loaded with credit card debt from buying too many cameras and that I'm working as a logger, you know, 2 days drive away from my home and family, you know, we kind of have these points of cognitive dissonance, I guess, is what I'm getting at with camera buying. Steve, I missed your last comment, so I'm going to try to pull that up here. Oh yeah, that's, yeah, the 400 meg codec. That's going to be interesting. Yeah, I'm putting it in ProRes when I do that, when I edit, and that's one thing that the editing is, it's a hassle. I don't know whether I need that much data going through my computer, because I've kind of reached the point at like with 150 megs. You know, it's robust enough that I can get a lot of benefit out of having the extra information, the extra data. But I think anything more than that, I mean, I'm going to want to try it just to see, but I don't know how much I'm going to actually be able to use that with a lot of what I'm doing, you know. Oh, that's interesting. I haven't, you mean issues like rendering and processing the GH5 footage? Is that what you mean? Yeah, 150 is certainly plenty for me. What I would love, and I don't know if they have any plans to do this, but if they could find it in their hearts to get the 60p in cinematic, that would be really sweet. Because the cinematic 4K is, I love that. I try to shoot in that as much as possible because I love how it looks. But interesting. I haven't known any issues with editing the 10-bit files. I mean, it's been good. It's just certain things do take a while longer, and like when you're, I edit in Final Cut Pro X or Final Cut Pro 10, and what I've noticed is that with some of those 10-bit files, when you kind of take like B-roll and you take clips and you drag them over top of the other clips, it turns into a like it has to render again on top of the other footage, so that every time you move it, even just like a little bit, like let's say like I had a shot of my brother when he's introducing himself. I have a shot of his cat on the porch, and I put that, just kind of stack that on top as B-roll, and then like when I was like, oh, I want to move it like 5 frames earlier in the film, then it has to like re-render that whole little clip every single time you do any little thing to it, which is a new thing and super annoying and time consuming. But at the same time, the footage looks beautiful, so it's like, yeah. But the proxy editing, I'm gonna have to get better acquainted with that, because most of the time I just kind of I haven't really spent a lot of time doing that. And in terms of hard drive space too, like I don't save a lot of my raw footage, unless it's kind of a long-term project or a bigger thing. But a lot of times with the videos, because the thing is, like with video or any creative thing, it's like once you put the pencil down, once you press the shutter button, you start recording, you make this thing, you create this entity that now you're responsible for it. And it's like it wasn't there, it wasn't a thing. You didn't feel obligated to capture that moment until you decided to push that button. And I try to kind of be mindful of the fact that like this stuff doesn't matter. Not that it doesn't matter, but that what matters is that you have to make that decision to disconnect. It's like you're going to do the work, you're going to make it, and then you're going to be done with it. And then once you're done with it, you're done with it. And not save stuff and try to always have it there, because that security is of always being able to go back. That's kind of, I don't want to say it's a dangerous thing, but it can be like overwhelming mentally, because you're thinking about like, man, I have all this stuff on the hard drive, and like what if something happens to it? And then like, at the end of the day, a lot of it is stuff, at least for me, that I feel like I can live without. It's like I want to make a film, I want to make it quick, and then like not rush it, but I want to make good decisions, and then I want to stick to those decisions and then just be done with it. And I do save some of my footage for just random things that I might need in the future, but I try not to worry about that too much. But Steve, I do appreciate those suggestions in terms of transcoding. I do usually, I'm trying to remember the settings, because I have the settings. I leave the media where it is, but I transcode and I edit in proxy, but I leave the original files where they are. I think that's the way that I have it set up. So yeah, the transcoding does take a while. And I will at some point check out Edit Ready. I have not heard of that, but that sounds handy. One of many things that I'm learning, or that I have learned about from doing these videos. So I do have a RAID drive. I have it, I think it's like in RAID 0 or RAID 1, where it's a little bit redundant. I think it's like 3/4 of it's a 16 terabyte drive. That is, yeah, it's four 4-terabyte drives, and I believe the way that it's set up, it has a certain amount of redundancy, so that it's effectively 12 terabytes total. So one of the drives kind of spreads stuff across, and so far it's been pretty good. And I have like additional drives that it's mirrored. Yeah, I have other drives too that I back stuff up with as well, just like normal hard drives, 3-4 terabyte drives that are, $100 on Amazon. Every couple of years I get one and throw some stuff on there. And so I have like working drives, and I have like kind of the archived stuff that it's like, okay, because I don't know, that stuff gets to a point where I'm just like, it's just frustrating, and I don't want to deal with it unless it's something that's commercial. where somebody's paying me money to handle that stuff, I'm just like, yeah, I made this movie. And because like you get to this point where you overthink things in your head and you're just like, oh man, maybe I need to save this. And it's like, no, I just walked around my block like for 15 minutes shooting stuff to test the camera to put on YouTube. I don't need to save that in an archive. Like that's, and so I found that being more selective sometimes helps me in that regard too. But my storage system is definitely something that could probably use some, some streamlining here in the future. But one of the problems right now too is just kind of back to the financial and the camera situation. My living and working situations are not well established enough to the point where I can say, yeah, I'm going to pay for a cloud backup and, get a really robust hard drive system that's going to be with me for the next, just tons of space that I know that I can't fill up. And I would still probably fill it up anyways, but like it's hard when you're kind of like, oh, I might be moving, I might be going here and there. And money is tight, and that's maybe not good excuses, but those are the reasons that I have kind of for the way that I've been doing things recently. So right now I have a good solid 6 terabytes or so left on my RAID drive, and then I have just a handful, like 3 and 4 terabyte drives that are loose that I just kind of put around. And I figure, you know what, and I mean, this is not, I don't say this from a professional standpoint. This is very much personal and artistic, if you will, standpoint, where I feel like, a lot of these moments, I've been very fortunate to live them and experience them once. And I don't, deserve, or like nobody owes it to me, to have these things for forever. And for all we know, like, what if the technology, and without getting too far down a rabbit hole, like what if the technology changes and the stuff becomes completely obsolete, or, this stuff, it's not like a Rembrandt. It's not going to hang in a museum somewhere 500 years later. It's just not. That digital technology is built to be obsolete. And so there's a certain extent to which it's kind of helped me to relax a little bit and say, all right, you know what, I'm going to do the best I can with what I have. And, if tragedy strikes and I lose some stuff, that sucks. The thing that to me is really important, the big thing, and again, this is on a personal level, is printed photographs. And like free prints, the app, you can just print stuff off like for free every month. Those are the things that to me I'm like much more concerned with, because the videos, I love having those and that those mean a lot, but like I can carry decades worth of photos in my backpack, in a handful of photos, and just stuff them in my bag if the house is, God forbid, on fire, right? Whereas your hard drives and all that stuff, it's like, granted, offsite backups, like I know, like with a cloud, that's a good practice to have like offsite and onsite backups for things. But there's a certain extent to which you got to recognize that you're playing against a pretty stacked deck when it comes to really having video files in perpetuity. Yeah, cloud is definitely something I would like to do, but again, the price. If I have somebody paying me to do video work, yeah, that's more of an option. But frankly, my freelance video game has not been super strong of recently. So, it's just hard. It's like I talk to people who don't have business, and they're like, "Oh, I love your stuff. Like, so great. Somebody should really pay you for that." And I'm like, "Yeah, somebody should. Do you know anybody who fits that description?" No, I don't, but man, somebody really should. So eventually, I might get rolling on that. But Google has unlimited storage of low-resolution JPEGs that you can put in the cloud. And so yes, I definitely do back up my images there. Of course, there are all sorts of nefarious concerns about privacy and harvesting personal information and photographs. But Flickr actually has something very similar, although I think I think they have a limit at like 1 TB or something like that, but for still images, you know, you can do a lot with 1 TB, especially if you're a little bit selective. Yeah. So yeah, video, like my hard drive is, it's like a cloud. It's a my cloud. So hook up with a company and do some travel videos. That's a great idea. Now, who's the person at what company? That's always been the hard part. I've always been like one introduction or one person, one connection, one handshake away from, you know, getting that availability or that opportunity to do video work. I mean, I'm still doing work and putting myself out there, you know, and we'll see where it goes. I'm not in a rush because I like what I'm doing now. I like logging. You know, I can do a bunch of different stuff to kind of keep the monkey off my back for now, and you know, I want to be able to really take the time to build my work out and not just do easy stuff that is kind of mindless just in order to get money. I'd rather work other jobs and be able to keep my filmmaking for my own purposes, you know. So yeah, well, good night, Jeff. Thank you for sticking around, and I need to go to bed too because my brain has been about 2/3 asleep for the last 45 minutes or so, but I enjoy talking about this stuff, so it's kind of hard for me to leave a session of friends who are chatting about something that, you know, I don't really talk to many people in real life or in physical space about photography and creative stuff. So anyways, guys, yeah, thank you all for sticking around. I really do appreciate it. It's fun to visit on here, and you know, be looking forward to hopefully seeing you guys next week. 11 p.m. is when I aim to start Eastern time, and I haven't had one of these live streams go for less than 90 minutes, although my aim is like 30 to 60 minutes, but you know, usually things kind of, there's like an after party. That's what we're doing here. This is an after party, talking about the GH5 and discussing fun camera stuff. And it's cool because I think, you know, you get a lot of different nuances and points that come out in these questions that maybe I wouldn't have thought of. Definitely I wouldn't have thought of. So anyways, folks, good night. Have a great weekend, and we will see you soon. Yes. Do a live and show us the GH5. Do you mean do a live stream with the GH5? Is that what you're suggesting? Because I can do, oh, I've had this on the whole time. Oops. There we go, turn that off. There's GH5 live. Yeah. Once I get I would love to do a live stream with using the GH5, but there's like I forget what it's called off the top of my head. There's some piece of technology. Yeah, I've been waving this thing. I'm sorry. I framed the camera like kind of weird. My phone is what I'm using to stream this, and like I was waving the camera all around earlier, but then I felt like maybe it was excessive that every time I would say the word GH5, I would have to, like, you know, bring it over. And yeah, that's true. It would have been dead. Zing, Jeff zinging the Sony cameras. Well, you're not wrong about that. Unfortunately, and frankly, the Fuji cameras too. They're not as bad as the Sony on the battery, but they're not great. But the battery on the GH5, man, it's almost as good as like my Nikon D600, my DSLR. It's like, it's right there. It's really, really good. And that's something that, you know, you don't think, it doesn't sound as sexy as like 60p 4K, but when you can go out there and keep shooting and you don't have to screw around with batteries, that's the difference between getting a shot and getting no shot and just being like, damn it, I just missed a really good shot. It's like, nope, still shooting, battery's still good. So yes, there's the GH5. Follow me on Twitter, and I will show you over the coming days the stills anyways that I'm shooting, and maybe even some little snippets. But if you're subscribed to me here on YouTube, I'm going to put the full videos that I'm uploading, and including some stuff still. I still have some stuff in the queue from the X-T2 and even some stuff that I shot with my tiny little Sony pocket camera over the summer that I've just been dragging my feet on. So all of that stuff is in the queue, in the hopper here. Gonna happen on the Living Vertical channel. Okay, guys, good night. Great chatting with you, and we will see you on the next live stream right here on the Adventure Photo Show. Later.